Who is Peter Sleeth? How did you get where you're at? What's your journey?
I came, I would say, from, for the benefit of your students there, from the lower middle classes of American society, where journalism was a chance to influence events. I went to journalism school at the University of Oregon, got out of journalism school, working my way through very small newspapers and small towns throughout California and Oregon and Michigan before working for the Denver Post and then for the Oregonian. And along the way, just had a great ride in understanding how American society works at a very nuts and bolts level, from local government to national government, and it shaped me and gave me great adventures and a nice way to raise a family.
Tell us about the Pulitzer reporting effort itself. My students would not have heard about the story, and so tell them the story and how it developed from the news team's perspective.
Oregon's a fairly rural state in the United States. It only has one major urban center, and this family was from San Francisco, which is a very large city. They had been up visiting December of 2007, family and friends, and were driving back to California. Tried to take a shortcut over the mountains, not realizing they'd misread the maps. This was a mother and a father and a 7-year-old and a 2-year-old child. They tried to cut over the mountains, got off on very bad roads, got lost, and found themselves caught in a snowstorm. They were missing for about a week before the search even got going. Nobody was really alert to what had happened to them for 5 or 6 days. By the time searchers had located a quarter of the state of Oregon, which was an area maybe 300 or 400 kilometers by 300 or 400 kilometers, to even begin to look for this family, they had been lost for a week, and they had been stuck and snowbound high in very rugged mountains that no one would even think of looking for them. The mother was breastfeeding her 2-year-old at the time, and ended up breastfeeding the 7-year-old to even keep both the children alive. In a nutshell, the husband tried to walk out and find help. He quickly became disoriented, ended up dying in a canyon in a stream. The mother miraculously was found by an independent man who was flying a helicopter around on his own looking for this family. That's kind of the outlines of the story. The news media didn't even get involved until these family had been lost for a week. That's when the police really told us about it. Because the area was so large, there were so many police agencies involved, none of them really knew where to look. And out of that confusion came the Pulitzer Prize, because we were able to show that the search was so fragmented, so badly conducted, that as a result, this man died and the rest of his family almost died, because the authorities were rather inept in their ability to search and find this family.
So what would you say was the key to winning Journalism's top prize?
Well, luck is, I think, always the key to it. In this case, you had a great story. You had a family people could identify with, a very nuclear family, a mom and dad and 2 small children. You could call them innocents almost. They were from a big city. They were lost in very rugged wilderness that they had no familiarity with. The whole state, if not the entire nation, was gripped, watching, trying to find these people in the search. And the first part of the story was, where did these people go? We did a good job as a newspaper in deploying our resources, which is difficult when you have a large search area. You have to have lots of reporters, lots of photographers, good.
So what would you say was the key to winning Journalism's top prize?
Well, luck is, I think, always the key to it. In this case, you had a great story. You had a family people could identify with, a very nuclear family, a mom and dad and 2 small children. You could call them innocents almost. They were from a big city. They were lost in very rugged wilderness that they had no familiarity with. The whole state, if not the entire nation, was gripped watching, trying to find these people in the search. And the first part of the story was, where did these people go? We did a good job as a newspaper in deploying our resources, which is difficult when you have a large search area. You have to have lots of reporters, lots of photographers, good coordination, trying to figure out where you should place people in case such and such happens, in case they find somebody or they find a body. That was stage one of the story. The second stage of the story was when they find the dead father, they find the mother alive. That's triumphant. The mother has survived. The children are alive. You've still got a great story. You've got survival amidst the sadness of the death of the husband, but the triumphant survival of the mother who suckles her children at her breast. And then finally, the third part of the story that I think won the Pulitzer Prize was the investigative report. And we came back, and we happened to have a great editor, Steve Engelberg, of the former New York Times investigative editor, who's been at the Oregonian, now runs ProPublica, the new internet investigative reporting site out of New York City. He came to my desk and said, there's something wrong here. I don't understand how these people couldn't have been found sooner. You need to find it out. And we ended up tracing cell phone signals and finding out that there were two engineers at a cell phone company who tried to help and were turned down at first by the police, but who eventually it was.
You mentioned in your resume that your reporting has helped change government policies and laws. I believe you said that in this case that you feel like it did, and perhaps you can tell us about some other stories as well that had an impact.
My wife and I were driving home the other day listening to a story on the radio, and they were talking about a new law passed in the legislature. It had come out of reporting that I and another reporter had done. I have to say that's the most satisfying part about being a reporter, being able to affect public policy for the better. In the case of the KIMS, what changed was 5 local governments. They're organized by counties down there. After that disaster that resulted in the death of James Kim, formed a new organization for searching in which 5 counties now cooperate instantaneously on any search, which allows all these counties to bring their different resources, helicopters, men, dogs, to bear at one time. That wouldn't have happened without our reporting. The state of Oregon is now spending money to build an all-new transmission system for satellite and regular cell phones around the state so that there's better connectivity so that when people get lost like this, they can use that triangulation I spoke of earlier to try to locate people who've used cell phones recently when they're lost. That all came out of this incident and the reporting on how it was so badly handled. In other cases, I guess most recently in 2006, a company out of Virginia tried to bring an industry to Oregon that's done a lot in India, where they bring up old ships onto the beach, break them up on the beach, and break the scrap metal up, and then sell it for scrap steel. Environmentally very damaging. It can carry invasive species. In our case, my reporting on how this one company, Bay Bridge Enterprises, is trying to bring that to Newport, Oregon, not only stopped that from happening, but resulted in a law that required that all shipbreaking, as it's called, occur within a dry dock, which it turns out is so prohibitively expensive it'll never be done again on the West Coast. It has to be done in sanctioned spots in Texas and Virginia and New Jersey. Things like that matter a lot. You can, as you asked me at the beginning where I came from, you can come from a place in society where you're essentially powerless, become a journalist, and with the force of an organization, a journalism organization behind you, and it takes all of that. It takes the attorneys, it takes the editors, it takes your colleagues to support you. You have this chance to change society for the better, maybe in small, incremental ways, but that's the way change occurs. It rarely occurs in great gulps like with the fall of the Berlin Wall. For every Berlin Wall, there's 10,000 small steps that took to get there, and that's a great thing about being a newspaperman in my book. I always likened it to medieval European history, where you'd see an army attack a castle. How they do it was with siege warfare, and they would fire catapult after catapult after catapult at the walls, hundreds and hundreds of stones, until the walls came down. And that's what you have to do as a journalist. You have to constantly stand there and attack. Even when it seems fruitless, you have to continue. It becomes a street fight at times. You have to get down and dirty and keep fighting until you win. And sometimes it seems like you never will, and sometimes you don't. But when you do, it's a glorious thing, because no one can do what you just did. And no one has any economic interest in doing what you do. Only somebody who has a passion for improving their society is going to do this kind of work, and only someone with that kind of drive is going to do something as selfless as trying to change a good that doesn't bring them personal profit.
You had the opportunity to go to Iraq and experience what it's like to report in a war zone. Perhaps you could share your feelings from that experience.
First of all, I would denigrate my experience because I was there 2 or 3 months during the invasion from March to about May of 2003. There were journalists like John Burns in the New York Times who stayed there 5 and 6 years, and that's true heroism. But I would say that anybody who's going to cover a war should be prepared. It sounds overly dramatic, but be prepared for the ultimate sacrifice, because you're in a position where you can die, and you're in a position where you can die oftentimes for inconsequential stories. One of the biggest takeaways I had from trying to cover a war is most soldiers never know where they're at. They're there because they're told. They don't know what town they're in. They don't know how close they are to Baghdad in this case. They don't even know. Most of them are too young to even understand the history of the country they're in. They don't understand the context they're fighting in, and that's the milieu you're in. It's very hard to be ant to see the entire anthill. So often you're trying to write a story about a war when you're in one small piece of it. And it's very difficult to do groundbreaking great work in that context. So you're A, risking your life. You could very well lose it, or parts of your body doing it, and B, you may never get a great story. That said, it's probably the most exciting, captivating, addictive thing you'll ever do as a journalist, because you know you're standing in the midst of history that will be read about for decades, if not hundreds of years, and you're an eyewitness to it. And it's just critical when you're doing it, even if you don't think, if you're in the rear, if you're not in the middle of the biggest battle at the time, that even if you're not writing a story, I think it's critical you keep a journal every day. As difficult as that is to do in a field, and it's very difficult, to write down what you're seeing, what you're smelling, what you're experiencing, because it all matters, and it will matter more than you know in the future. In 2003, the United States government had put hundreds of us journalists who'd never been to war with the troops for whatever purpose. It both brought positive publicity for the government, because it's very hard not to identify with soldiers in battle. They're generally nice young men and women, and they're in the most dramatic situation of anyone's lives. But on the other hand, it also allowed all of us to see the bad side of the war. And it brought about, I think, a greater truth to war coverage than Americans have ever seen before. I think people in America today understand more about the Middle East than they could have possibly understood had we been kept out of the field as we were in the first Gulf War. So I'd say if you get a chance to do it, do it. But if you have a family, think twice before you go on the field or something like that. It changed me in kind of subtle ways. And again, I feel like a fool speaking about it because I was there a few months. When there are journalists who spent years there, Dexter Filkins is another great, I think, hero of American war correspondence. But I came away with a couple things. I came away with great respect for soldiers, no matter what side they're on, because they are doing a thankless, horrible job. I came home with a great revulsion for violence that, I grew up as the son of a World War II soldier, and they killed the Japs and killed the Krauts when I was a kid, and I watched every war movie ever made in America 10 times. I can't watch a war movie anymore. I cannot. That Saving Private Ryan, that's a very popular World War II movie that came out a few years ago. I can't see that. I just cannot see that. I can't watch people in those situations anymore, because I saw just enough of it in real life that you understand more, I think, the gravity of the situation when you see civilians and soldiers wounded and hurt and killed. And it's very difficult for me anymore to watch that kind of thing. It's always as a newspaperman, before I went to war, I had trouble covering and reading stories about women and children being hurt, be it child abuse, rape, anything like that. It's very difficult for me to read a story about Iraq anymore, especially about the casualties. At the end of the Jim Lehrer News Hour, when they will run the pictures of the soldiers, I have to get up and leave the room. I cannot watch the faces of the dead soldiers. I don't know what that says about me, but it changed me profoundly in that respect. I can't watch that kind of violence and that kind of loss anymore.
Perhaps in reflecting back on what you've learned over these 25 years or so of your career, perhaps you could come up with some keys to succeeding in journalism, whether they relate to writing or interviewing or reporting techniques. What are some keys that I should be teaching my students?
Well, first of all, they shouldn't even be considering journalism if they don't have a passion for public service, because ultimately that's what it is. It is nothing more than social work. And if you don't have a compassion for people and for society and for the workings of democracy, you should not be involved in it, because that is the only reason to be involved in it. To stay a journalist for decades and decades, it requires great tenacity. It never pays enough. It sounds romantic when you're 22, but when you're 42 and have 4 children and a wife at home and you have to pay the bills and you're still not making enough money, even though you're doing something you love, you have to have a great tenacity and a great belief in the importance of what you do. That number one, you have to have that above all things. After that, it's like being a carpenter. You need to learn very well how to build a wall, how to pound a nail, and that involves learning how to interview people and not be afraid to ask hard questions, how to write a story. This is not fiction. You don't need to be John Updike. You don't need to be Ernest Hemingway. All you need to do is learn the tools to construct a story, and that's all you're doing. This is craft work. This is not art. Once you get those tools, and I say if you find a great editor, I've 2 or 3 in my life, you want to attach yourself to those editors. If you find a great writer that you can make a friend, attach yourself. If you can't do that, great writers in the paper and cut their stories out and read again and again how they wrote them, how they constructed them, where they put their words, where they put the emphasis. Learn how to do it. And remember, you're a carpenter. You're not Picasso. If you think you're Picasso, if you think you're an artist, if you think you're great, your words are going to come out looking like a Picasso painting, and nobody can deal with that. You have to think of yourself as a craftsman and learn the tools of being a craftsman, how to interview correctly, how to write a story correctly, how to go into the field with enough money in your pocket, enough credit cards in your pocket, that you don't have to come home because you run out of money when you're in the middle of the desert in Arizona and you need $50 in cash and you think to have it. I mean, all of these things are just tools you learn, and you want to pick the absolute best teachers you can find out in the field to teach you that. And they're all willing to help you and teach you if they see that you're sincerely interested in becoming a really good newspaper man or woman.
What are some of the tips you could give students on interviewing?
Well, I think honesty is important. You need to be honest with people about what you're there for. That said, there are certain techniques you can use. I remember somebody had told me that there is an arc to an interview, that you want to come in, be friendly, try to get people to open up, talk about if you're in their office, the artwork they have on the walls, the pictures of their children. You want to talk to them, get them to open up and speak with you, and as the arc of the interview goes higher and higher and you're beginning to mine for the information you want, about midway to 2/3 through that interview, you want to hit them with the really hard questions. You want to be as mean as you're going to be. You want to ask them if they robbed the bank, whatever. But by the end of the interview, you want to leave them smiling. And the reason you want to do that is because you're usually going to need to come back. And you do not want to leave somebody with a bad taste in their mouth. You want to leave somebody believing that they've had an honest, fair chance to be heard. And it's best to do that by asking the hardest question somewhere between the middle and the end. But by the end, you want to go back to the nice stuff. complimenting them on whatever. There's little tricks like that for interviewing. There's funny tricks people have about when you're scared of interviewing someone, you're afraid of them. Somebody told me once he always envisioned that person sitting on the toilet, and that would take his fear away. For me, it's the idea of a bullet going by my head and thinking, well, that's a lot more important than this guy. You have to find little tricks to help you feel brave and to feel smart and to feel in control. There's other things, tape recorders are needed sometimes, and if you can use them, they're great. Now they have digital recorders that are very reliable, but you still want to take notes the whole time in case your tape recorder quits working. If you have the time, which most reporters don't, it's nice that when you're interviewing someone to come visit them the first time without a tape recorder or a piece of paper, and just walk with them and talk with them and just get a sense of who they are. The next time you come back, you might bring a pad of paper. And the third time you come back, you might bring your tape recorder and your pad of paper as you build up trust and credibility. And this isn't meant to trick anyone. It's meant to give you both a level of comfort in talking. Now, sometimes interviews are more combative than that. Then you just got to be steely and tough and sit there and be able to dish as well as receive. And those things just take time and learning, and it's important to be conscientious with each interview and think about what you're doing and think about what you learned when you get back. I always came back and listened to tapes and thought, I talk way too much, like I am right now. And talking too much is usually a great weakness for young reporters. It's best to just shut up and listen.
How about documents? What are some tips you can give students as far as getting government records and perhaps other documents that are important to a story?
Documents are an ironclad way to make your case and print it in the paper without being sued. They're critical to really good reporting. In the United States, we have fairly good laws that allow us, journalists and the public, access to public documents. That's really, really important to have those laws, and if you have the opportunity to fight for those laws in your legislature or your Congress or your Parliament to make sure that the public has access to the public's business. Any way you can get documents is fair game in my book. Whenever I speak to a group of students or an interest group or anything like that I speak with, and I talk about investigative reporting, I always say documents are key for us. Your version of the events is important, and we may or may not be able to use it publicly in the press, depending on the legal situation. We can almost always use documents, so if you have any, you can send them to me. Send them in plain brown letter, envelope. I don't need to see your return address. You always want to get documents to verify what somebody has said if you can. Documents are the gold standard, particularly government documents that can be authenticated. You need to be careful that they're not fakes and that you haven't been tricked. That does happen. I know reporters who've made their career being called document reporters, where all they did was go after documents to become a great reporter. Bob Woodward, the former of the Washington Post, known far and wide for his Watergate reporting, was and is a great document reporter. He gets documents to back up as much of his interviewing as he can. You can't say too much about getting hold of documents. Any way you can that's legal.
If you could kind of share with us why you did go into journalism and what you have enjoyed about it and what maybe you haven't enjoyed about your career.
I went into journalism because it was a way, at the time when I was young, I thought I wanted to be a writer. And I thought being a journalist was a way to become a writer, and it can be. But I also went into it because I really wanted to help people. And I thought it was a great way to help people and give me a chance to do something that mattered in society that I otherwise wouldn't have been allowed to do. That has been the great joy of being a journalist, of being able to change my world in small ways. I mean, I can't claim that anything I ever did electrified the world or changed anything that anybody will ever remember before. But I know, and the people that I wrote about and changed the world for, they know. That is an immensely satisfying way to make money. Now that said, the money in journalism is poor and it's getting worse. The worst part of being a journalist is you don't make enough money. You never make enough money. When you're a financial writer, which I was for a number of years, and you cover Wall Street, you cover stocks, and you cover bonds, you see great deals. You go, man, I could buy the stock and make some money, but you can't. That's a conflict of interest. You're never allowed to participate. You have to stay on the sidelines and watch. And that, I think, is the hardest thing about being a journalist. You have to prepare yourself for a world where you're not going to make a lot of money. There's exceptions to that, but there's not many. But again, that said, I've been able to raise a nice family, have a nice home. You know, everybody's healthy, relatively happy, can't complain. I would much rather have done this than have been a carpenter my whole life.
In this part of the world, it can sometimes be dangerous to be a journalist. There have been literally dozens in the Russia and the CIS countries who have been killed for the things they've written. And so here I am trying to teach people to become journalists in a situation where indeed there have been some people killed locally. Do you have any advice or insights you could share with somebody in this situation?
Well, the man I was asking you about at the beginning of the thing died over in Egypt. I'm trying to teach young journalists how to properly cover a political election. And it brings me to tears thinking what journalists do in countries in your neck of the woods and all over the world where they have to die for stories. And a certain amount of that, I guess, is necessary. But as practical advice, I would tell any young journalist, whether they're in Kazakhstan or Egypt or Russia or the United States, no story is worth dying for. Do not go there. You do not need to die for a story. There's better ways to go at a story. Some of the techniques you can use on a very practical level, and if you know that a contractor built a bridge badly, and that the bridge collapsed and killed 20 people, but that the contractor is connected to the president of your country, and if you write about this story, it could bring ruin to you, your family, maybe death, maybe you shouldn't write that story. It doesn't mean you need to run away from the story. People that behave in that manner, that is, exploit the people for their own gain, do it in many, many ways. Maybe you go back and look at 5 projects they did that never killed anybody that may have defrauded the people monetarily. Maybe you go back and look at how they started their career. Did they steal? Did they whatever? There's ways to approach stories from you pick at the outside of it rather than jump right into the heart. You never need to die for a story. That does nothing for anyone except in very rare cases. And I just cannot advocate it on a real basis. Idealistically, you can say that's wonderful. I just don't see dying for a story. I don't think that's right. I think there's always smarter ways to try to figure out how to expose the injustice rather than sacrificing your own life for it. Yes, the problems with public construction, the problems with the bidding process, the problems with how public money is spent on public projects, and what kind of, there's just a lot of ways to think about stories without putting your head on the chopping block. It's easier to put your head in the chopping block in a democracy like the United States where journalists don't get killed. It's very rare we ever get hurt over here because we have a strong system of government and laws that protect us. That's not true in a lot of nations, and I recognize that, and it takes even more courage to be a journalist there, and you have to be 10 times more careful in those countries. And you should reach out to international journalism organizations. There's a lot of them that watch very closely what happens to journalists in different countries and try to get the support and help of your comrades in other nations. In this day and age of the Internet, it's much easier to reach those people. You don't have to be alone. I wish each and every one of your students the best of luck at changing their own little piece of the world.